Welcome to Stories Cafe, where I'm your host for today's intriguing mystery. We're joining Miss Marple in the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead for The Harvest Comes Late. Before we start, I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in from. Share in the comments. This is a tale of hidden secrets, wartime betrayal, and long overdue justice. Grab a warm cup of tea, stay curious, and let's dive in. The Harvest Comes Late, Chapter 1. A disturbed morning in St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple was tending her garden on a gentle May morning, closely inspecting her cherished delphiniums. The spring had been unusually wet, even for England, yet she was delighted to see her flowers flourishing despite the heavy rain. She straightened, pressing a hand to her lower back, and surveyed her garden with quiet contentment. It was just past 9:15, and St. Mary Mead hummed with its familiar morning rhythm, unchanged for as long as Miss Marple could recall. From her spot, she could see Mrs. Ellington's maid beating a rug with perhaps excessive zeal, a sign that Mrs. Ellington had likely criticized the girl's work again. Miss Marple noted to invite the maid for tea soon. She recalled the girl had a young man in much Benham, and an engagement seemed likely. She was kneeling to tackle a patch of persistent weeds when the sharp creak of her garden gate being flung open startled her. Looking up, she saw her friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry rushing up the path, hatless, her face alight with unmistakable excitement. "Jane!" Mrs. Bantry called out before reaching her. "The most dreadful thing has happened." Miss Marple rose, calmly removing her gardening gloves. Mrs. Bantry was prone to dramatics, but there was something in her expression that suggested genuine distress. "Good morning, Dolly," said Miss Marple calmly. "You appear quite upset. Perhaps you'd better come inside and I'll make us some tea." "How can you think of tea at a time like this?" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, though she followed Miss Marple obediently into the cottage, once inside with the tea tray properly arranged before them, for Miss Marple maintained that all news, however disturbing, was better received with the fortification of a good cup of tea. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "George Mallory has been murdered, found strangled in his own barn this morning by that dreadful man, Thatcher, who works for him." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes widened slightly, but she poured the tea with a steady hand. "Dear me," she said, "how very unpleasant poor George Mallory. He had only just returned from London, had he not?" "Yes, 2 days ago, after a fortnight away on what he called business. Though Mabel Simmons at the post office said he'd never had any business in London before in his life." Mrs. Bantry accepted her cup of tea and added, rather as an afterthought, "There was a war medal placed on his chest. Isn't that odd?" "Most peculiar," agreed Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Was it his own medal, do you know?" "I couldn't say. Colonel Bantry might know. But he's gone to the farm now. The police have been called, of course. Though I don't suppose that young Inspector Slack will make much of it. Never does, miss." Marple nodded, taking a small sip of her tea. "And who found him, did you say? Harold Thatcher? You know, that surly farmhand who's worked at Mallory Farm these past 5 years or so, never very communicative, that one Hewitt to the barn early this morning, and found poor George on the floor already, quite cold." Miss Marple's fingers worked at an invisible piece of knitting as she considered this information. "It's those new people," Mrs. Bantry continued decisively, "that Welsh widow and her son, who moved into the caretaker's cottage at Gossington Hall. Mrs. Evans, she calls herself. Very quiet, very respectable. Seeming, but there's something not quite right there, Colonel. Bantry says the boy has a surly look about him." They arrived. "Only a month ago, I believe," Miss Marple inquired. "That's right. And now, barely settled. There's a murder. You mark my words, Jane, they're connected to it. Somehow, perhaps," said Miss Marple, mildly though. "I find it unwise to form theories too hastily, human nature being what it is. Well, George Mallory wasn't a man without enemies admitted. Mrs. Bantry, Thomas Wilkins, has been arguing with him for months over that piece of land by the stream and Elelanina. Hastings has never forgiven him for jilting her all those years ago, though one would think at her age she'd have put such things behind her. Miss Marple permitted herself a small smile. I don't believe one ever entirely forgets such disappointments. Regardless of age, Mrs. Bantry suddenly looked thoughtful. It's strange, though. George seemed quite changed when he came back from London. Martha, that's his housekeeper, told my cook he was jumpy and distracted, kept looking out of windows as if expecting someone, and he made a visit to the solicitor in Muchingham yesterday morning. Indeed, Miss Marple's eyes took on the faraway look that her friends knew. Soul, that reminds me rather of old Mr. Barnaby from the village where I spent my summers as a girl. He returned from a trip to Brighton most dreadfully altered in his manner. It transpired that he had encountered someone from his past, someone he had hoped never to see again. Mrs. Bantry, used to Miss Marple's habit of drawing parallels with village incidents, merely nodded impatiently. Yes, well, the whole village is in an uproar. Margaret, that's George's sister, is prostrate with grief. Dr. Haydock has been called to attend to. Her Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her expression one of gentle concern. Outside her window, the peaceful scene of St. Mary, me continued undisturbed, the church clock chiming the half hour, the baker's boy delivering his wares, a pair of village children playing with a hoop along the lane, yet with this tranquil setting. The darker elements of human nature had once again asserted themselves, as they always did, reflected Miss Marple, no matter how serene the surroundings. Chapter 2, Tea at the Vicarage. The vicarage at St. Mary, me had stood for over 200 years, its weathered stone exterior bearing silent witness to generations of village life. On this particular Wednesday afternoon, it was the setting for what promised to be a most illuminating gathering. Miss Marple made her way along the gravel path. With measured steps, her knitting bag in hand, the murder of George Mallory, 2 days prior, had set the village abuzz with speculation, and she knew that Thevakar's wife, Mrs. Clement, would have assembled a representative sampling of local opinion. The drawing room was already quite full when Miss Marple entered. Mrs. Clement, a kindly woman with an unfortunate tendency toward what her husband called Gothic imagination, greeted her warmly. Miss Marple, we were just discussing the dreadful business at Mallory Farm Suck. A shocking thing to happen in our village, indeed, murmured Miss Marple, taking the chair nearest the fire. Though May had brought milder weather, her bonus still appreciated the gentle warmth. She surveyed the assembled company with quiet interest. Mrs. Price Ridley was there, of course, her hat adorned with artificial cherries that trembled indignantly with each pronouncement she made. Dr. Haddock sat nearby, his intelligent eyes watchful beneath bushy brows. Miss Weatherby and her sister had secured the sofa, while Mr. Thick, the solicitor, stood by the mantelpiece, in conversation with Thomas Wilkins, whose farm adjoined Mallory's property. I was just saying, continued Mrs. Clement, as she poured tea, that Inspector Slack seems quite convinced the newcomers must be involved, that Mrs. Evans and her son, very convenient, arriving just a month before the murder, said Mrs. Price Ridley with grim satisfaction. And there's something not quite right about that boy, watching everything he is with those dark eyes of us. My Emily says he was asking questions about the farm's hereabouts only last week. A natural curiosity, perhaps, suggested Miss Marple. Mildly, young boys are often interested in such things, Thomas. Wilkins gave a short laugh. Nothing natural about those. 2. The woman jumps like a startled rabbit whenever anyone addresses her directly. As for the boy, well, too intense, by half miss. Marple accepted her tea with a word of thanks. "You knew Mr. Malalary quite well, did you not?" "Mr. Wilkins." A slight flush appeared on Wilkins's weathered face. "Neighbors for 15 years. Not that George was the easiest man to get along with, mind you. You quarreled over the water rights to Dingleream, I believe?" inquired Mr. Pethick, with the precision of a man who had likely drawn up the legal documents in question. "A simple disagreement," said Wilkins stiffly, "settled months ago, not according to Martha," interjected Mrs. Price Ridley, George's housekeeper, "told me you were at the farm," shouting at him not a week before he left for London. Misunderstanding." Wilkins muttered nothing more. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she began the heel of what would eventually become a warm winter sock. "It's so difficult when neighbors disagree." She observed, "I remember poor Mr. Badger and Mr. Timms from the village, where my aunt lived, such dreadful arguments over an apple tree that straddled their property line, and then, when poor Mr. Timms died so suddenly," she left the sentence unfinished, but several pairs of eyes turned to Thomas Wilkins, who shifted uncomfortably. "I was in the pub with Jim Harris when George was killed," he said defensively. "You can ask him yourself. I'm sure no one is suggesting otherwise," said the vicar's wife hastily. The Duckler opened to admit Eleanor Hastings, a tall, angular woman of about 50, who carried herself with the rigid posture of one who has faced disappointment and determined never to. "Been to it, so sorry I'm late," she said, removing her gloves with precise movements. "Margaret asked me to help sort through some of George's papers. The poor woman is quite beside herself." "Naturally," murmured Mrs. Clement. "Such a shock, and you've been such a good friend to her all these years, Elena." "We were at school together," said Miss Hastings, accepting a cup of tea. One doesn't abandon old friendship simply because she paused, and Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her mouth before she continued. "Well, the past is the past. George Mallory jilted her 30 years ago," whispered Miss Weatherby to her sister in a voice that carried perfectly across the room. "Dreadful business she never married." Miss Hastings's spine stiffened further. "If that were possible. I heard that James Cooper had words with George the day before he died," she said, clearly eager to direct conversation elsewhere. "Something about the war, I believe." "James Cooper?" asked Dr. Haddock, with sudden interest. "The man's hardly left his cottage since he returned from Korea. What business would he have with Malalary?" "They served together in the last war, did they not?" said Mr. Prick, along with young Blackwood from the manor, the one who never came back. A brief silence fell at the mention of the war. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. "George came back rather altered from London," observed Mrs. Clement. "Martha said he was not himself at all." Nervous, starting at shadows, said he'd seen a ghost, added Mrs. Price Ridley with relish. "That's what he told Fred at the Blue Boar, did he indeed?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "How very interesting," the truly peculiar thing said. Dr. Haydock. "Is that medal found on his chest not Mallory's own?" "I'm told Inspector Slack was asking if anyone knew of Malalary having a collection." "He didn't," said Miss Hastings firmly. George had little interest in such things. He never spoke of the war if he could help it. The conversation turned to speculation about the medal's significance, theories growing progressively more elaborate. Miss Marple listened attentively, her bright eyes moving from speaker to speaker, noting not just what was said, but how it was said, the hesitations, the emphasis, the careful omissions. When the grandfather clock in the hall struck 5, she gathered her knitting, thanked Mrs. Clement for a most pleasant afternoon, and took her leave. The walk home gave her ample time to consider what she had learned. The village talked of the Welsh widow and her son, but Miss Marple's thoughts were occupied with old wars and older wounds, with ghosts from London and medals belonging to dead men. St. Mary me was peaceful in the afternoon, sunlight, but beneath its tranquil surface, currents of fear and secrecy were stirring currents that had already led to one death and might, if not carefully navigated, led to another Chapter 3. A visit to Mallory Farm the following morning dawned, bright and clear with a sort of determined cheerfulness that seemed almost indecent. Given recent events, Miss Marple, after a breakfast of toast and tea, considered her plans for the day. A visit to Mallory Farm seemed in order, not out of ghoulish curiosity which she deplored, but because one could not help feeling that the heart of this mystery lay there. She selected a small pot of her homemade blackberry preserves as a pretext for the visit. Condolence calls required some small offering, and Miss Marple's preserves were well regarded throughout the village. The walk to the farm was just over a mile a distance. She still managed quite comfortably. Despite her advancing years, Mallory Farm stood on a gentle rise, its weathered brick facade half hidden by an ancient wisteria. The barn, where George Mallory had met his death, lay to the right of the main house, its doors now secured with an official police notice. Miss Marple averted her eyes from it as she approached the front door and knocked. Martha, the housekeeper, answered. Her eyes were redimmed, her capable hands twisting nervously in her apron. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, "you'll be wanting to see Miss Margaret. I expect she's in the sitting room. Not well at all, poor lady, but she's seeing visitors. Says it helps to keep her mind occupied." "Thank you, Martha," Miss Marple replied gently. "I've brought a little something. Perhaps you might find a place for it in the kitchen." The sitting room at Mallory Farm was a comfortable, if somewhat dated, apartment. Heavy Victorian furniture, inherited rather than chosen, filled the space. Margaret Mallory sat by the window, her thin frame seeming almost lost in the large armchair. She was a faded woman, 5 years older than her brother, with the same square jaw, but none of the robustness that had characterized George. "Miss Marple, how kind," she said, extending a trembling hand. "Please sit down. I find company helps, though I can't offer much by way of hostess duties. I'm afraid, my dear, no one would expect." "In," said Miss Marple, settling herself in the chair opposite. "Such a dreadful shock for you, I still can't believe it." Margaret Mallory said, "Who would want to harm George? He wasn't perfect. Who is but murder? It seems impossible." Miss Marple murmured, sympathetic agreement, her sharp eyes taking in the details of the room. The mantelpiece stood a collection of framed photographs. She noted a wedding portrait of the Mallory's parents, a faded sepia image of Margaret in tennis whites, and several of George, including one in uniform standing with 2 other young soldiers. "Your brother had just returned from London, I believe?" Miss Marple inquired, after an appropriate interval of commiserating silence. "Yes, 2 weeks he was gone. Most unlike him. George rarely left the farm overnight, let alone for a fortnight." Margaret twisted a handkerchief in her fingers. "He wasn't himself when he came back." Miss Marple, not himself at all. "In what way?" My dear, nervous, distracted, kept looking out of windows, starting at small noises and secretive. George and I have lived together these 30 years since our parents died, and he never kept secrets from me, but he wouldn't say a word about what took him to London." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Most disturbing for you, I'm sure. Did he mention seeing anyone in particular while he was away?" "No, though I asked directly. Said it was business, but what business would George have in London? He was a farmer. Through and through." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "The only curious thing was that he visited Mr. Pethick the very day after. Returned legal matters. He said indeed Miss Marple's needles appeared in her hands, though she had no recollection of removing them from her bag, and the metal that was found has, Inspector Slack determined whose it was." A shadow passed across Margaret's face. "It wasn't George's, if that's what you're asking. They've taken it away for identification." The conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Harold Thatcher, the farman who had discovered George Mallory's body. He was a gaunt man of about 50 with deep-set eyes that seemed to observe everything while revealing nothing. "Begging your pardon, Miss Margaret," he said, "but I need to know about the shipment of feed that was due. Police say I can carry on with the regular work." "Oh, yes, of course. Harold, the orders in George's desk. I'll find it for you." Presently, Margaret seemed flustered by the interruption. Harold's eyes flickered briefly to Miss Marple, assessing and dismissive in a single glance. "No rush, miss. Just when you've time." He turned to leave, then paused. "Will you be speaking to the police again today?" "I don't believe so." "Why do you ask?" "No reason. Just that they keep it asking the same questions over and over about Mr. George's London trip, about strangers in the village, as if I'd noticed such things." His tone suggested he noticed a great deal indeed. No good will come of city folk poking about in country matters after. Harold had left Margaret sighed deeply. "He's been with us 8 years. Ever since he came looking for farm work, George hired him on the spot. Said Harold reminded him of someone he'd known in the war. He's a hard worker, if not the most sociable of men, miss." Marple chose her next words carefully. "I understand your brother served with Captain Blackwood from the manor, and a Mr. Cooper who lives in the village now." "Yes, though James Cooper was just a private. Then they were in the same unit. Poor Henry Blackwood never came home, of course." Margaret gestured to the photograph on the mantelpiece. "That's them before they shipped out. George in the middle, Henry on the left, and James on the right." Miss Marple rose to examine the photograph more closely. 3 young men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, smiled with the invincible confidence of youth. George Mallory's square, honest face was easily recognizable. Despite the passing years, Captain Blackwood was handsome in a conventional way. His smile, reaching his eyes, the third man, James Cooper's, stood slightly apart. Despite the friendly pose, a certain weariness already visible in his expression. "There was a fourth friend, wasn't there?" Miss Marple asked, returning to her seat. "I seem to recall Dolly Bantry mentioning someone." A flicker of something surprised concern crossed Margaret's face. "Richard Evans, not in that photograph. He joined their unit. Later George mentioned him. Occasionally. I believe he was killed as well, though the circumstances were never clear." "Evans," repeated Miss Marple thoughtfully. "The same name as our new village residents. A common Welsh name," said Margaret. A little too quickly. "I very much doubt there's any connection." Their conversation turned to other matters. The difficulties of running the farm, the kindness of neighbors, the weather. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, Martha appeared in the doorway. "Excuse me, Miss Margaret, but that boy's been hanging about the lane again. Shall I tell Harold to send him off?" "What boy?" asked Margaret, with a slight frown. The Evans boy, staring at the house. He was bold as brass. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. "No, leave him be. The child was probably just curious. There's been enough unpleasantness." As Miss Marple walked back toward the village, she pondered this curious reaction. The soft breeze carried the scent of hawthorn blossom, and overhead a lark sang with carefree abandon. Yet, beneath this peaceful surface, Miss Marple sensed currents of old griefs and older secrets rippling outward from that lonely farmhouse on the hill. Chapter 4. The Welsh Widow. It was 3 days after her visito Malalary farm that Miss Marple found a suitable opportunity to make the acquaintance of Mrs. Evans. The occasion presented itself in the form of the church's spring fed, an annual event that drew most of the village regardless of their regular church attendance. Miss Marple, who had been placed in charge of the jam and preserve stall for more years than she cared to remember, had a perfect vantage point from which to observe the proceedings. The fete was held in the vicarage garden, a pleasant space with ancient yew hedges and a small ornamental pond. Various stalls had been arranged around the lawn. Mrs. Bantry presided over homemade Cakes, Colonel Bantry had been persuaded to supervise the coconut shy, and Miss Weatherby and her sister managed a table of knitted items that Noon particularly wanted, but everyone felt obliged to purchase. Miss Marple spotted Mrs. Evans almost immediately. The Welsh widow stood slightly apart from the main crowd Aslam figure in a navy blue dress that, while perfectly respectable, had clearly been carefully mended in several places. She was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps no more than 40, with dark hair pulled back in a severe style that did nothing to soften the anxiety in her expression. With a murmured word to her assistant, Miss Marple left her post and approached the refreshment table, carefully positioning herself next to Mrs. Evans, who was hesitating over a plate of cucumber sandwiches. "Do try on," Miss Marple said gently. "Mrs. Clement makes them particularly well. Just the right amount of butter." Mrs. Evans started slightly, as though unaccustomed to being addressed directly. "Thank you," she said in a soft voice that held the lilting cadence of Wales despite an obvious effort to modulate it. "It all looks lovely." "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," continued Miss Marple. "I'm Jane Marple. You must be Mrs. Evans. We're all so pleased to have new residents in the caretaker's cottage." The woman's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her plate. "Bronwyn Evans," she replied. "It's kind of you to welcome us. My son, David, and I are still settling in such a charming cottage," said Miss Marple. "I used to visit the previous occupant, Mrs. Bailey, quite often before she went to live with her daughter in Eastbourne. The garden has such possibilities, though I fear it's been rather neglected." "David has been trying to tidy it," said Mrs. Evans. Her gaze darted around the fete, and Miss Marple had the distinct impression she was looking for her son. "He enjoys being outdoors. How nice boy should have fresh air and exercise." "Is he here today?" A shadow crossed Mrs. Evans's face. "He's helping with the skittles, I believe." He doesn't care for crowds much. We lived very quietly before coming here in Wales, was it?" "Yes, a small village in the valleys, much smaller than St. Mary Me." She hesitated, then added, with apparent reluctance, "My husband died 5 years ago, a mining accident." "My dear, how dreadful for you both," said Miss Marple, with genuine sympathy. Mrs. Evans nodded, her eyes downcast. After a moment she said, "I understand there has been a tragedy here as well. At one of the farms people have been talking about it." "Yes, indeed. Poor George Mallory strangled in his barn. Such a shocking thing to happen in our quiet village. Did you happen to know him at all?" The question was posed with such innocent gentleness that its sudden intensity might have gone unnoticed, but Miss Marple observed the slight stiffening of Mrs. Evans's shoulders, the momentary freeze before she shook her head. "No, I never met him. We've kept to ourselves since arriving." Her voice was steady, but a faint tremor in her hand caused a drop of tea to spill onto her saucer. "Of course," murmured Miss Marple, "though, in a small village like St. Mary Me, one tends to encounter everyone. Eventually, it reminds me a little of Mrs. Elkins from Danmouth. She was new to the area and quite determined to avoid social engagements until it transpired that she had once been acquainted with Dr. Masters' wife under rather different circumstances." Mrs. Evans's eyes widened slightly. "I really must find David," she said. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, it was a pleasure to meet you." As the Welsh widow moved hurriedly away, Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. There had been fear in those dark eyes, not the fear of a woman who had committed murder, she thought, but something deeper and more complex. Miss Marple was reminded of a hunted animal perpetually alert for danger. She had just returned to her store when she noticed David Evans helping to reset the skittles at the far end of the garden. Tomas was a thin boy of perhaps 15, with his mother's dark coloring and a watchful intensity that seemed beyond his years. Unlike most boys his age engaged in such a task, He showed no signs of enjoyment, performing his duties with methodical precision, while his eyes constantly scanned the crowd. Those eyes met Miss Marple's for a brief moment, and she was struck by the weariness in them and something else, recognition. But that was surely impossible. She had never met the boy before today. Miss Marple was still pondering this when she became aware of a commotion near the vicarage gate. Inspector Slack had arrived accompanied by a constable. His presence at a church fete would normally be unremarkable, but his purposeful stride and grim expression suggested this was not a social call. The inspector made directly for the vicar, engaged him in brief conversation, then turned and scanned the garden. His gaze settled on Mrs. Evans, who'd retreated to a bench beneath an apple tree. With a peremptory gesture to his constable, he began to make his way toward her at the Skittles stall. David Evans had gone very still. Miss Marple saw him abandon his post without a word and move swiftly through the crowd toward his mother. There was purpose in his movement, not guilt, she thought, but protection. Inspector Slack always did have a regrettable sense of timing, commented Mrs. Bantry, who had appeared at Miss Marple's elbow. Surely he could have waited until after the fete to question the poor woman, perhaps said. Miss Marple, watching as David reached his mother's side just as the inspector approached. Though I suspect waiting is not in Inspector Slack's nature. They say he's convinced the Evans boy was seen lurking around Mallory Farm the day of the murder, continued Mrs. Bantry with undisguised relish. And now there's talk of a letter found among George's things. Something about Wales indeed. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. How very interesting. Across the garden, Inspector Slack was speaking to Mrs. Evans. His manner brusque. Despite the public setting, the widow's face had gone quite pale, but she answered with a quiet dignity. Beside her, David stood rigid, his young face set in lines that seemed to age him a decade. Miss Marple observed the scene with thoughtful eyes. In her experience, fear came in many forms, as did guilt. The art lay in distinguishing between them and in understanding the complicated webs of human relationships that so often led to tragedy. She suspected that the web surrounding George Mallory's death was more complex than even Inspector Slack imagined, with threads stretching back across many years and many miles. Chapter 5, War Memories. The day after the church fete, Inspector Slack paid a call on Miss Marple. She received him in her sitting room offering tea, which he declined with the air of a man who considered refreshments and unnecessary delay too serious business. "Just a few questions, Miss Marple," he said, notebook poised. "I understand you've been asking around about George Mallory." Miss Marple arranged her knitting needles carefully, not asking Inspector, merely listening. In a village this size, one cannot help but hear things. Inspector Slack sniffed. "Well, since you've got your ear to the ground, so to speak, I might as well tell you we've identified that medal found on Mallory's body, Military Cross, awarded to Captain Henry Blackwood, 1944, reported killed in action in France," dear me said. Miss Marple mildly, "How very peculiar. Captain Blackwood from the Manor. I believe he served with Mr. Mallory." "That's right. Blackwood Mallory and James Cooper were in the same unit, along with a fourth man named Richard Evans." Slack's eyes narrowed slightly. "Interesting coincidence. That name Evans is a common Welsh name, Inspector, so everyone keeps reminding me." Slack tapped his pencil against his notebook. "Mrs. Evans claims she never met Mallory before coming here, and her boys as the same. But I've got 2 witnesses who saw young David hanging about Mallory Farm the day before the murder, and Mallory had just returned from London, where, by the way, he visited a military records office." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "Did he indeed? Most interesting. We found a note in his pocket." Slack continued, "Just an address in London, and the words 're' confirm it. Living mean anything to you? I couldn't say. Inspector, though. The initials might suggest Richard Evans. Slack nodded grimly. My thoughts. Exactly. Richard Evans was reported missing in action, presumed dead, but unlike Captain Blackwood, no body was ever recovered. And the medal? Prompted Miss Marple gently. How might that have come to be placed on poor Mr. Mallory's chest? That's what I'm trying to determine, said Slack with a touch of irritation. It wasn't Mallory's. His own medals were found in a drawer untouched, and it wasn't taken from the manor. Old Colonel Blackwood died years ago, and the house has been empty since his widow passed last winter. Miss Marple made a sympathetic noise. Such a sad business. All those young men. The war has left its mark on so many lives. It's ancient history now, said Slack dismissively. This is about a murder committed last week. I'll be speaking to James Cooper today. See what he has to say about his sold war comrades. After the inspector had taken his leave, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Ancient history, Slack had called it, but she knew better. The past was never truly past, particularly when it came to matters of life and death, of loyalty and betrayal. That evening found Miss Marple at the Blue Boar, St. Mary Maisonley pub. It was not her usual haunt, but she had mentioned to Dr. Haddock that she fancied a light supper out, and he had gallantly offered to accompany her. Most kind of you, Doctor, she had said. I believe Tuesday evenings are quite pleasant there, not too crowded, and, indeed, the public bar was only half full when they arrived. Miss Marple noticed immediately that James Cooper occupied a corner table. He was a gaunt man in high surly 50s, with the hollow look of someone who had known too many battlefields. His right hand, she observed, was badly scarred, an old war injury perhaps, or something more recent. They took a table near enough to overhear without being obvious. Dr. Haddock, understanding Miss Marple better than she sometimes gave him credit for, kept up a stream of village gossip, while she listened to the conversation at Cooper's table, where he had been joined by two other men. Slack been to see you then? One was asking. Cooper nodded, taking a swallow of his beer. This morning? Aching about the war, about George and Henry and the medal? Asked the second man, leaning forward. What would I know about it? Henry's medals went to his family. Cooper's voice was flat, but Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of tension. Ancient history anyway. Not to George, apparently. Martha says he was going through old photographs the night before he died. Army ones, the past. Catches up with everyone. Eventually, said Cooper. With sudden bitterness, even George Mallory of the conversation shifted to more current matters. But Miss Marple had heard enough later. As Dr. Haddock walked her home, she mentioned casually, James Cooper seems rather changed by his recent service. Career, wasn't it? Cooper. Hawk looked surprised. He wasn't in Korea. The man's not been in uniform since 1945. His health wouldn't permit it. Not with that lung damage. Dear, how foolish of me, murmured Miss Marple. I must have confused him with someone else. The following morning she set out for a visit to the post office. Miss Edmonds, who had served as postmistress for over 20 years, greeted her warmly. Just the usual wool catalog today, Miss Marple, she said, passing a slim parcel across the counter. Thought there's been such a flurry of mail since poor Mr. Mallory's death, police notices and such. And of course, his sisters, been in and out arranging all the sad business that follows it, must be very difficult for her. Agreed. Miss Marple had Mr. Mallory received any unusual correspondence before his death, before his London trip. Perhaps Miss Edmonds hesitated, professional discretion, wearing with the natural inclination to gossip well. I suppose there's no harm in saying. He did get a letter about a week before he left. Foreign stamp, it had, I noticed, because we see so few of those foreign. How interesting. Not exactly foreign. Miss Edmonds corrected herself from Wales. Unusual handwriting. Very neat, but sort of shaky, if you know what I mean. As if written by someone elderly, or perhaps someone whose hand wasn't steady, Miss Marple thanked her and departed, pausing at the corner to exchange pleasantries with the vicar as they spoke. She noticed Mrs. Evans and her son walking briskly toward the shops. The boy carried a school satchel, and Miss Marple noted with interest that it was left-handed, an observation confirmed when he paused to adjust the strap with his dominant hand that afternoon. Miss Marple sat in her garden, outwardly focused on her roses, but inwardly piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered. There was a pattern emerging, as there always was, but this one was complex, a web of old loyalties and older betrayals. Spanning years and distance, the sound of a bicycle bell roused her from her contemplation. It was the vicar's youngest son, Timothy, delivering a message from Inspector Slack. "Miss Marple," he said importantly. "He says to tell you they've arrested Mrs. Evans and her son for questioning, and that you were right about the handwriting. Thank you," Timothy said. Miss Marple pressing a peppermint into his hand. She had said nothing to Slack about handwriting, which suggested the inspector had made discoveries of his own. She watched the boy pedal away, her normally placid features troubled in her experience. The obvious solution was rarely the correct one, particularly when it satisfied all the apparent facts too neatly. Chapter 6. The Matter of Inheritance. Miss Marple was not accustomed to interfering directly in police matters. Her method, refined over many years, was to observe, to compare, and only then to draw conclusions. Yet the arrest of Mrs. Evans and her son troubled her deeply. She had seen fear in their eyes, certainly, but not guilt, at least not the sort of guilt that accompanied murder. The morning after their arrest, she put on her best hat, the one with the artificial cherries that she kept for significant occasions, and walked to the post office. Miss Edmonds was sorting the morning mail when Miss Marple entered. "Good morning," Miss Marple said. The postmistress cheerfully, "I've set aside the latest knitting pattern magazine for you." "Just came in. How very thoughtful," said Miss Marple, accepting the magazine. "I was actually wondering if you might recall anything more about Mr. Mallory's correspondence before his death. It seems so significant, given recent events." Miss Edmonds glanced around the empty shop and leaned forward confidentially. "Well, I didn't mention it before, but there were several letters from London in the weeks before his death. Very official looking, from a solicitor's office. By the look of them, a solicitor." Miss Marple's interest quickened. "Do you recall the name of the firm? Hard, Castle, Newman and Price. I believe very impressive letterhead." Miss Edmonds lowered her voice further. "And there's something else. Inspector Slack came by yesterday with a letter found at Mallory Farm, the one from Wales I mentioned. Asked if I recognized the handwriting. I couldn't say for certain, but it did look remarkably like Mrs. Evans's writing on the form she filled out to redirect any mail from her previous address." Miss Marple thanked her and departed, her mind working rapidly. A London solicitor, letters from Wales, and George Mallory's mysterious journey to the capital pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. But the picture remained incomplete. Her next stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement would be preparing for the weekly meeting of the Women's Institute. Mrs. Clement was not only the vicar's wife, but also sister-in-law to the manager of the local bank, a connection that made her privy to certain financial whispers in the village. "Jane, what a lovely surprise," exclaimed Mrs. Clement, ushering her into the sitting room. "You're early for the meeting. I thought I might help with the arrangements," said Miss Marple mildly, though they both knew her skills at floral arrangement were politely tolerated rather than admired. Such a difficult time for the village with the tragedy at Mallory Farm. And now the arrests, dreadful, business agreed. Mrs. Clement setting out teacups with more haste than precision. though Inspector Slack seems quite convinced apparently. The boy's handwriting matches some threatening notes. "George received indeed," said Miss Marple. "I had not heard of any threats." "Oh yes, Margaret found them when going through George's desk, and there's talk that George had come into money recently, or was about him." Mrs. Clement paused, then added in a hushed tone, "Herbert mentioned that George had been inquiring about transferring a substantial sum from a London bank, quite out of the ordinary, for a man who kept every penny in the Muchingham and District Savings Bank his entire life. How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "Did he mention the source of these funds and inheritance?" Herbert gathered from a distant relative, though why it would come through a London solicitor when the family has used Mr. Thick for generations. I can't imagine. Miss Marple could imagine several reasons, none of them entirely innocent. She recalled the letter found in Mallory's pocket, reconfirmed living. If Richard Evans had not died in the war, as reported, and if there was an inheritance involved, she was still pondering these connections. When the vicarage telephone rang, Mrs. Clement answered. It listened for a moment, then turned to Miss Marple with wide eyes. "It's Margaret Mallory." Or she said, "Hand over the receiver," she says. "The Evans boy has been released for lack of evidence, but his mother is still being held, and there's been some unpleasantness at the farm after leaving the vicarage." Miss Marple made her way directly to Mallory farm. The walk gave her time to arrange her thoughts, to test her emerging theory against the facts as she knew them. By the time she reached the farm lane, she had formed a tentative hypothesis, one that would explain the medal, the London trip, and the timing of the murder. What it did not yet explain was why Mrs. Evans and her son had come to Smerry Me in the first place. Margaret Mallory received her in the sitting room, more composed than at their last meeting, but still showing signs of strain. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call again," she said, though her tone suggested she found the visit more dutiful than kind. "I'm afraid things are in rather a state. That dreadful Evans boy was caught going through George's study last night." "Going through the study?" Miss Marple echoed. "How did he manage that?" "Understood he was in police custody. He was released yesterday evening. Insufficient evidence or some such nonsense. Harold found him in here after dark. The boy ran off, but not before he'd been through George's desk looking for something specific Harold said was anything taken." Margaret frowned. "That's the strange part. Nothing valuable is missing, but Harold thinks he took some papers or photographs. It's hard to be certain. George was never the most organized person I see," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "and Mrs. Evans remains in custody." "Yes. Thank goodness. Inspector Slack is convinced she's involved somehow. The handwriting on those threatening letters matches hers precisely, and now they've discovered she used a different name before coming here, called herself Mrs. Lloyd. In Wales, apparently." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly at this information. A change of name suggested flight concealment, or perhaps a second marriage. The possibilities multiplied. "Miss Mallory," she said carefully, "did your brother ever mention a wartime acquaintance named Richard Evans? I believe he served with George and Captain Blackwood." A shadow crossed Margaret's face. "He mentioned him occasionally, not often." She hesitated, then added, "Reluctantly, George always seemed uncomfortable when the subject arose. I gathered there had been some unpleasantness during the war, though George never provided details." The conversation moved to other topics, but Miss Marple's attention had been caught by a small detail, the absence of the photograph she had noticed on her previous visit, the one showing George Mallory with his fellow soldiers. Had that been what young David was searching for as she prepared to leave? Harold Thatcher appeared at the door to the sitting room. "Begging your pardon, Miss Margaret." "You and he," said his gaze sliding briefly to Miss Marple. "But there's a gentleman from London to see you. Says he's from Hardcastle, Newman and Price, about Mr. George's affairs." Margaret looked startled. A solicitor? But Mr. Petherick handles all our legal matters. This concerns the Blackwood estate, he says. Margaret rose, clearly flustered. I'd better see him. Please excuse me. Miss Marple left alone momentarily. Miss Marple glanced around the room. Her gaze settled on a small desk in the corner where several letters lay in a disorderly pile. The top envelope bore the London solicitor's letterhead, and beneath it was a torn corner of notepaper with a partial sentence. Visible. Confirm Blackwood inheritance must be divided equal. The rest was hidden beneath other papers. Inheritance divided. The pieces continued to arrange themselves in Miss Marple's mind as she made her way home through the quiet lanes of St. Mary. Me where secrets lay buried like the lanes themselves beneath years of placid village life. Chapter 7. Night at the Farm. The release of Mrs. Evans came as no surprise to Miss Marple, 2 days after her visit to Mallory Farm. Dolly Bantry arrived breathless at her cottage with the news they've let her go. Jane Inspector Slack is in the most frightful temper about it, apparently. The evidence wasn't sufficient after all. Miss Marple continued her knitting with unruffled calm. I rather thought it might not be. Was any reason given something about the handwriting on those threatening letters? A second expert said it was similar, but not conclusively the same, and her solicitor proved she was in the post office at the time of the murder with witnesses. Mrs. Bantry settled more comfortably into her chair, but the most interesting part is that James Cooper provided an alibi for the boy. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. James Cooper. How unexpected, isn't it? Says the boy was helping him repair his garden shed that afternoon. Most unlikely, as they'd never exchanged 2 words before, according to the village. But Inspector Slack couldn't shake his story. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. And there's more. Mr. Pick let slip to the colonel that George Mallory changed his will just after returning from London. Left everything to his sister, of course, but with a curious addition, a substantial sum to be held in trust for the rightful Blackwood heir indeed, said Miss Marple softly. How very interesting that evening. She sat by her window watching the dusk gather over Stamary. Me, the case had developed in unexpected directions. Yet the central puzzle remained: why had George Mallory been killed? And what connection did the Warmedel have to his death? The inheritance from the Blackwood estate was clearly significant. But how did it relate to Richard Evans, to Mrs. Evans, and her son, to the threatening letters, and to Harold Thatcher's apparent hostility toward the Evans family? Miss Marple's reflections were interrupted by the insistent ringing of her telephone. It was Dr. Hawk, his normally composed voice tense with urgency. Miss Marple, I thought you should know there's been an incident at Mallory Farm. Harold Thatcher has been attacked, a blow to the head. He's conscious, but badly concussed, and someone broke into the house. Dear me, said Miss Marple. How very disturbing. Is Margaret all right? Shaken but unharmed, she was attending a meeting at the Women's Institute. When it happened, Thatcher was alone in the house. There was a pause before the doctor added the curious thing is Thatcher insists he recognized his attacker, though he's being rather evasive about the details. Says it was too dark to be certain. But he has suspicions apparently. He muttered something about that boy before I sedated him, but clammed up when Inspector Slack tried to question him further. After the call ended, Miss Marple sat motionless for several minutes. Then, with sudden decision, she reached for her hat and coat. The hour was not too advanced for a visit to Margaret Mallory, particularly under such disturbing circumstances. The farm was eerily quiet when she arrived. A solitary police constable stood guard at the door, but he knew Miss Marple by sight and allowed her to enter. After a brief explanation, she found Margaret in the sitting room. Pale but composed, with Inspector Slack in attendance. Miss Marple, he said with barely concealed impatience, this is hardly the time for social cause. I came as soon as I heard, she replied mildly. such a dreadful thing to happen. Miss Mallory Haddock tells me Mr. Thatcher was injured, found him on the floor of the study, said Slack, before Margaret could answer. A blow to the back of the head, not life-threatening but nasty enough place, was ransacked, clearly looking for something specific. The same room where the Evans boy was caught searching, observed Miss Marple. Slack's eyes narrowed exactly, and now he's nowhere to be found. Neither is his mother packed up and left the caretaker's cottage this afternoon. According to the gardener at Gossington Hall, inspector said Margaret, with sudden sharpness, I've told you the study window was broken from the outside. David Evans is a slight boy. Harold is a grown man with military training. How could the boy have overpowered him? Military training, Miss Marple echoed her interest. Quickening, Margaret looked momentarily discomforted. Harold served in the warlike George. She hesitated, then added, in fact, that's why George hired him. They'd been in the same regiment, though not the same unit. Harold came looking for workabout. Years ago mentioned his service record, and George took him on without references. The conversation continued. But Miss Marple was only half listening, her mind working rapidly. 8 years ago, shortly after the war's end, a man with military training seeking out a former soldier from the same regiment, and now a break-in with something specific. Being sought, Miss Mallory, she said. When Slack had stepped outside to confer with his constable, the photograph that was on your mantelpiece, the one of your brother with Captain Blackwood and Mr. Cooper, it seems to be missing. Margaret looked startled. Why, yes, how observant of you. It disappeared the night David Evans was found in here. I assumed he'd taken it, though I can't imagine why it was of no value except sentimental, unless the photograph itself contained information, suggested Miss Marple. Something written on the back, perhaps just the names and the date, said Margaret, and a note in George's handwriting. The 3 musketeers plus 1 behind the camera. Rather silly, but they were all so young then, plus 1. Behind the camera, repeated Miss Marple, thoughtfully. Richard Evans, I presume. Margaret nodded slowly, I believe. So George rarely spoke of him. I gathered there was some unpleasantness. Richard was suspected of cowardice, I think, though. George would never confirm it. The following morning found Miss Marple at Dr. Hawk's surgery, ostensibly for her regular checkup, but in reality, with a very specific question in mind. I was wondering, doctor, she said, as he checked her pulse about war injuries. I have a nephew, you see, who served in the Far East. He sustained an injury to his hand. Terrible burns even after all these years. His handwriting is quite distinctive, shaky yet precise. If you understand my meaning, Dr. Haddock nodded thoughtfully. Quite. Common with certain types of nerve damage, the effort to control the tremor often results in very deliberate, almost artificial precision. I've seen it in several exervismen like James Cooper, suggested Miss Marple. Innocently, Cooper, his injuries were respiratory gas exposure, I believe, though, now that you mention it, Harold Thatcher has just such a hand, tremor left-handed. Now, though, I understand he was naturally right-handed before his injury. Miss Marple digested this information silently. Later that day, Chevy cited the local school where she occasionally helped with the children's reading. The headmistress, Miss Thompson, was an old friend. I was wondering, Miss Marple said as they shared tea in the staff room, about young David Evans. Such a quiet boy, I understand, very reserved, but bright, confirmed Miss Thompson, excellent at mathematics, and surprisingly good penmanship for a boy's age. She hesitated, then added, though Miss Barton mentioned something curious about his writing. He's strongly left-handed, yet his technique suggests he might have been trained initially as a right-handed writer, not unusual for his generation. Of course, left-handed, like Harold Thatcher. Since his war injury, Miss Marple recalled the boy's distinctive handwriting that she had glimpsed on a school paper, and a certain quality of deliberate precision that might to the untrained eye resemble the tremulous writing of a man with nerve damage. As she walked home, Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the post office. Miss Edmonds stood in the doorway gesticulating excitedly to a small cluster of villagers. Most extraordinary thing, she was saying a letter for Richard Evans addressed to him, care of Malalery. Farm marked a turned sender, and stamped deceased by the post office in Wales came. In this morning's delivery, after all these years, Chapter 8, The Harvest of Truth. I really don't see why we've all been summoned here, said Inspector Slack, his irritation poorly concealed as he glanced around Miss Marple's modest sitting room, with the Evans woman and her son vanished and Thatcher still recovering in hospital. Precisely why I thought this gathering might be helpful, Inspector, interrupted Miss Marple, mildly pouring tea with a steady hand. Sometimes, when one reaches an impasse, it is useful to review the facts from the beginning. It was 3 days since the attack on Harold Thatcher. Miss Marple had quietly arranged for several people to join her for tea that afternoon. Inspector Slack, Margaret Malalery, James Cooper, Mr. Pethick, the solicitor, and Dr. Haydog. The unexpected addition was a grave-looking gentleman from London, whom she introduced as Mr. Hardcastle of Hardcastle, Newman and Price. Miss Marple, began Margaret, with thinly veiled impatience. While I appreciate your concern, I fail to see how a tea party will help catch my brother's murderer. Oh, I think it might do more than that, said Miss Marple, setting down her teacup. You see, you believe? I know not only who killed your brother, but why. And it all begins with something that happened during the war. She turned to James Cooper, who sat stiffly in the corner armchair, his damaged breathing audible in the quiet room. Mr. Cooper, you served with George Mallory, Henry Blackwood, and Richard Evans, did you not? Cooper nodded wearily. The four of us were in the same unit. Blackwood was our captain. Good man, Captain Blackwood, died in France in 1940. Continued Miss Marple. But Richard Evans was only reported missing, presumed dead. No body was ever recovered. She paused. How interesting that his military medal should appear on George Mallory's chest after all these years. If you're implying that Evans killed George, you're on the wrong track, said Cooper gruffly. Evans is dead has been for years. That is what George Mallory believed until his trip to London, said Miss Marple. I think he discovered something there, or rather, someone Airy confirmed. Living, said the note in his pocket. Mr. Hardcastle cleared his throat. Perhaps I might clarify matters. He said, our firm has been handling the estate of Colonel Henry Blackwood. Senior Captain Blackwood's father, the colonel, died last year, leaving a substantial inheritance to be divided equally between his son, if living, or his son's closest comrades from his unit, if deceased. That would be George Mallory, James Cooper, and Richard Evans. But with Blackwood and Evans both dead, the inheritance would go to the survivors, Mallory and Cooper, said Inspector Slack, showing sudden interest. Precisely, said Mr. Hardcastle. However, shortly before his death, Mr. Mallory contacted our office, claiming to have evidence that Richard Evans might still be alive. He requested time to investigate before the estate was settled. And did he provide this evidence? Asked Mr. Pethick. He was to meet with me the day after Headied, said Mr. Hardcastle simply. Miss Marple nodded as if this confirmed something she had long suspected. Mr. Mallory's discovery presented a problem for someone who had been counting on that inheritance. But there is more to this story than money. She turned to Margaret. Your brother hired Harold Thatcher 8 years ago without references, solely on the basis of their shared regiment. Did you never find that curious? Margaret frowned. George had a soft spot for veterans. Harold mentioned he'd been searching for his brother who went missing in the war. George understood family loyalty. His brother repeated, Miss Marple thoughtfully. Yes, that explains a great deal. You see, I believe Harold Thatcher is Richard Evans's brother. A startled silence fell over the room. Thatcher came here searching for information about his missing brother, continued Miss Marple. He secured a position with George Mallory, hoping to learn what had happened to Richard 4 years. He believed his brother dead until recently. This is pure speculation, protested. Inspector Slack not entirely, said Miss Marple. The postmistress received a letter addressed to Richard Evans at Mallory Farm, marked returned to sender and deceased by the Welsh Post Office. Why would such a letter arrive after all these years, unless someone had made recent inquiries? Someone like George Mallory during his trip to London. And you think Thatcher killed Mallory? Over this inheritance business, asked Dr. Hawk. It seems rather extreme, no, said Miss Marple firmly. I think he killed him over betrayal, you see. I believe George Mallory betrayed both Captain Blackwood and Richard Evans during the war. Something happened in France, something that led to Blackwood's death and Evans's disappearance. James Cooper's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. You're walking on dangerous ground. Miss Marple, George Mallory reported that Richard Evans had abandoned his post, accused him of cowardice, said Miss Marple. But what if it was Mallory who had acted dishonorably? What if Evans, facially disfigured and suffering from amnesia after an explosion, eventually recovered enough to remember what had really happened? And what was that? Asked Inspector Slack skeptically. I suspect that Mallory left both Blackwood and Evans to die after an ambush, saving himself instead of aiding his comrades as duty required. Captain Blackwood died, but Evans survived unrecognizable due to his injuries, and with no memory of his identity. He made a new life for himself, perhaps. In Wales, perhaps elsewhere, until something triggered his memories. The Welsh widow breathed, Margaret Mrs. Evans. But she can't be Richard Evans? No, agreed Miss Marple, but I believe she is Richard Evans's wife, his widow, as she thought herself to be. Until recently, the Mrs. Lloyd, she was known as in Wales, suggests a second marriage after believing her first husband dead, and the boy asked Mr. Thurig, Richard Evans's son, almost certainly said, Miss Marple left-handed like his father became after his injuries, with similar handwriting that could be mistaken for the threatening letters Margaret found letters. I suspect Harold Thatcher planted to direct suspicion toward the Evans family. But if Richard Evans is alive, where is he now? Demanded Inspector Slack. I rather think, said Miss Marple gently, that he's in hospital with a concussion. Harold Thatcher is Richard Evans' inspector. He came here years ago seeking answers about his own past, using his brother's name when George Mallory returned from London with proof that Richard Evans might be alive, having discovered military hospital records of a soldier with amnesia. Harold realized that Mallory was about to expose both his deception and the wartime betrayal. The medal, said Cooper suddenly, Blackwood's medal. Harold Richard placed it on George's chest as a symbol of justice. Margaret Mallory had gone very pale, but the break in Harold's injury self-inflicted, I'm afraid, after he realized the photograph with the annotation +1 behind. The camera might reveal his true identity. Richard Evans was not in that photograph because he was taking it. An experienced police surgeon would have noted that the injury was consistent with a fall rather than an attack. This is all very interesting, Miss Marple, said Inspector Slack, but without proof. I believe Mr. Cooper can provide that, said Miss Marple, turning to the silent veteran. You recognized Harold as Richard years ago, didn't you? That's why you provided an alibi for young David. You were protecting Richard's son? Cooper looked down at his scarred hands. We made a pact, Blackwood and Evans and I, to look after each other and each other's families. George broke that pact in France. He raised his eyes to meet Inspector Slack's. Yes, Harold Thatcher is Richard Evans, and yes, He killed George Mallory for betraying us all those years ago. In the silence that followed, Miss Marple poured more tea. The afternoon sunlight slanted through her windows, illuminating the dust mows that danced in the air outside in the lanes of Stamary. Me life continued in its tranquil rhythm, unchanged by the dark harvest of truth that had been reaped within these walls that evening. After her visitors had departed, Inspector Slack to arrange for Harold Thatcher's arrest, Margaret to come to terms with her brother's true nature, the others to their respective homes, Miss Marple sat in her garden, watching the sunset. She thought of Richard Evans, who had lost his identity, his memory and his face, only to rebuild his life in search of truth. She thought of his son, who had likely never known his father's real name until recent events had forced their revelation. And she thought of George Mallory, whose harvest of betrayal had come terribly late, but had come nonetheless. Human nature, reflected Miss Marple, was much the same. Everywhere these seeds of character once sown would eventually bear fruit, whether bitter or sweet, and no secret, however deeply buried, could remain hidden forever beneath the quiet soil of an English village. Thanks for joining us for The Harvest Comes. Late did you suspect Harold Thatcher's true identity before Miss Marple revealed he was actually Richard Evans? Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you enjoyed this adventure with Miss Marple. Don't forget to hit subscribe for Mysteries Daily. Until next time. Remember, Miss Marple's wisdom. Human nature is much the same everywhere, and no secret, however deeply buried, can remain hidden forever beneath the quiet soil of an English village.